Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are coming to us from. Welcome to WITA and our second spotlight interview with key figures in the global trade community. Before we get to today's event, a few notes about upcoming WITA events. Tomorrow at 10 a.m. Eastern Time, we have a very timely event looking at the latest U.S. moves on digital trade. Moves that were cheered by some, but have created a lot of consternation in the business community and questions around the world. We're also planning an event for the week after Thanksgiving with our good friends at the Asia Society Policy Institute to look at recent moves on IPEF that are taking place in San Francisco and where that may be headed. That event will take place on Wednesday, November 30th. Information on both those events and how you can support WITA in 2024 can be found on our website, www.wita.org. Keep an eye on that page for another special event in December looking back at 250 years since the Boston Tea Party, which first made trade a flashpoint in American politics before there even was a United States. As you know, if you've watched any of our 250 plus webinars since 2020, we like to call out the names of some of those who are with us online who you can't see on Zoom. So welcome today to some old friends, Rolf Lundberg with Choice Hotels and former Chief Trade Counsel to the Senate Majority Leader, former ITC Chair Paula Stern, former USTR General Counsel Warren Mariama, and Christina Bach-Yeiter with the Clayton Yeiter Institute of International Trade and Finance at the University of Nebraska. We'll be actually holding our second WITA Academy Pathways program with the Yeiter Institute and students at the University of Nebraska, University of Kansas, and University of Denver in December. So welcome, Rolf, Paula, Warren, and Christina, and welcome to all of you. If you're watching today on Zoom, you can ask questions of Ambassador Hills using the Q&A tab on Zoom, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can toward the end of our session. You should have also received our speakers' biographies by email so we can dispense with lengthy introductions. Of course, welcome back to my good friend and our partner in this series of Spotlight interviews, Ambassador Rufus Yerxa, a senior advisor at McLarty Associates, a former WTO Deputy Director General and a former Deputy United States Trade Rep. We'll be announcing future Spotlight events that Rufus will be hosting in front of his fireplace in the weeks to come. And of course, our very special guest today, who truly needs no introduction, Ambassador Carla Hills, is an icon in the global trade community. She served as the United States Trade Representative to President George Herbert Walker Bush from 1989 to 93, where she negotiated both the original North American Free Trade Agreement and the Uruguay round of the GATT. She also served as the Secretary of Department of Housing and Urban Development under President Ford, and before that was an Assistant Attorney General in the Civil Division at the Department of Justice. It's truly an honor to welcome you back to WITA, Ambassador Hills, and lest I forget to mention, both Rufus and Carla are recent recipients of WITA's Lifetime Achievement Award. Rufus?
Well, Ken, first of all, thank you, and thanks again to WITA. I'm looking forward to this second in our session of interviews, and of course, it's a great honor to have Ambassador Carla Hills. Carla, of course, you all know she was USTR for 4 years. Fewer people know that I served as her deputy during that period.
And an outstanding deputy.
Well, I not only learned a great deal from you, Carla, but I remember once a colleague asking me, what were you like? And I said, well, she's one tough lady at the negotiating table, but always fair and honest. And I'm sure that'll come through in today's discussion.
Thank you.
So as you know, Carla, we're going to be talking about this paradigm shift in U.S. trade policy since 2016. What are its implications and your thoughts about where this might be going and your concerns about the policy, and then get into some of the specifics. Of course, I don't want to go into elaborate detail about what that shift has been, but we all know, the move away from free trade agreements, the withdrawal from TPP. There haven't been any new free trade agreements since then, or any really meaningful negotiations. And at the same time, an increasing use of the tariff authority, certainly in the fight with China and issues like steel, and also increasing concerns about the WTO system. About the blockages, of course, in the appellate body. We can talk about that. And the more recent developments in the Biden administration and with Congress in new industrial policy, subsidies, especially in the green energy space, that have certainly significant trade implications. So we can talk about all of these things. I think where I'd like to start, if it's all right with you, Carla, is with kind of a general broad question. I mean, do you see this as a significant shift away from prior policy? Do you view it as a kind of coherent policy shift, or still something that is in the works? And what are your general thoughts about its implications, both for the economy and for our trade relations around the world?
Well, Rufus, it's a great pleasure to be on the program with you. And you were a superb deputy and know more about trade than most people, in no matter where located. Yes, my view is there has been a fundamental shift. For 75 years since we negotiated the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, and the 30 years since we negotiated the World Trade Organization, we have been really dedicated to trying to get global markets open. And every economist, from Ricardo to the Peterson Institute, have indicated that the opening of markets generates GDP. Let me say that what you do with that GDP increase is a policy decision, but opening of trade does create growth. And we've seen that. I think the most modest estimate since we joined the WTO 30 years ago, it about $300 billion in increased GDP. So I think that it's unfortunate that we've gone to industrial policy. I don't think it's efficient. I don't think it's geopolitically helpful. And I would like to get back to the trade policies that we've had in the previous administrations, both Democrat and Republican. But it won't be easy. And I have to say that politically, if you walk down the street, most Americans do not think that trade has been helpful to them. And we're facing an election. So I'm not anticipating that either side of the political aisle is going to pick up the flag and say, hey, we need to open up our trade markets. We need to set the example for the rest of the world. You're not going to hear that.
So, Carla, you mentioned, the general reaction of many voters to this. I mean, you and I aren't in the business of sort of political advice, but obviously, I'm interested in your thoughts about the potential of a Trump-Biden presidential election, and how the trade issue, I mean, there's obviously much bigger and many other issues that are going to determine the outcome of this campaign, but how the two candidates might position themselves on the trade issue. You saw that Trump had floated this idea of a 10% across the board tariff increase. Biden has been more circumspect about talking about those issues. He's spent quite a bit of time, obviously, on the industrial policy and on more manufacturing in the U.S. And of course, recently, this meeting with Xi Jinping, which clearly indicates some desire to sort of manage the relationship with China. So I'm wondering if you just had a few thoughts on not a political prognosis, but just how the trade issues play in that election and what you see as the differences between the two.
I don't think that trade is going to be a big issue. I think you're right that Trump has said he's always been a person who believes that tariffs are a good tool and that deficits are bad. And never mind that you could tell him, look, I have a deficit with my grocer, but hopefully I have a surplus with my employer. Deficits are not bad, and one should not use tariffs against everyone with whom you have a deficit, you really ought to look at the costs, and the costs are humongous, and we ought to get away from that kind of a policy issue. On the trade policy of President Biden, his team talks in terms of worker-centric. And I have a legitimate concern about the lowest quintile, but I don't believe, and I don't think there's an economic study that would prove that trade was the problem. Trade did not take jobs. What it did, what challenged our jobs was the rapid change in technology. And that has been going on since the agricultural revolution. We experienced that, where we were making all of our economic gains off the land. And then we got plows and various mechanisms that were driven, and we needed far fewer workers, and they streamed into the cities as poor. We're doing that. We ought to learn from prior experiences and try to educate those that are losing their job to take the new jobs that technology is creating. And we're already hearing that there's a shortage in certain lines of public-private partnerships would make a huge difference, and much more effective than tariffs.
So, in the days when you and I were working on the NAFTA and the Uruguay round, there was quite a bit of bipartisanship on trade, although I have to say we probably had more challenges on the Democratic side with some of those agreements than on the Republican side. But I'm just curious, because today it seems like there's been an erosion of support in the Republican Party generally, and I'm seeing how much more difficult it is for any president. Let's just say Biden wins the election post 2024, and he actually wants some new negotiating authority and is prepared to move in a direction like more trade access type of negotiations. Do you see problems with rebuilding the kind of coalition that you used to advance those agreements?
It will take leadership, without a question. And if it doesn't come from the president, whether it be Trump or Biden, it should begin at the lower level. Institutions like WITA can make a difference. The American Chamber of Commerce, the local Rotary clubs, working with mayors. When mayors speak out and say, these tariffs hurt our agricultural workers, the political leaders listen. And so I think that we could have a partnership between public and private. We've seen that work in other areas. I mean, I just read an article in Fortune magazine about how J.P. Morgan invested in Detroit over the past 10 years, when Detroit had lost population, huge amounts of population. Its housing was down. Its workers were fleeing. And by investing in upgrading, it made a difference. So a partnership between a bank, the businesses, and the mayor made a difference. And we see that actually mayors are reaching out on trade issues. You read about governors reaching out and setting separate examples with countries. So we need to have leadership, and it should be at all levels, and it should start now and with universities, and educate people about why trade matters.
So if we could just maybe shift a little bit to some of the key areas of concern in today's trade policy. I think I'd like to start with a bit of a China discussion, if you don't mind. I mean, obviously, huge friction during the period right after the 2016 election, leading ultimately to the Trump decision to increase tariffs. and then negotiate a sort of quantitative access commitments from China on sort of a sector by sector basis. But even despite that, the tariffs, most of the tariffs stayed in place, and in fact, Biden has maintained those. Those access agreements haven't really produced very much, and the overall trade balance with China hasn't changed much. Now, of course, there's a great deal of focus on outbound investment and export controls, moving more towards technology concerns and frankly concerns about the use of those technologies for the Chinese military. So I'm kind of wondering how you see things developing with China, in the wake of this latest meeting, but also with that hangover of issues, frictions with China also in the multilateral system, obviously. And what are your thoughts about the U.S.-China trade relationship and where it ought to be going?
I was encouraged by the Biden Xi Jinping meeting. They did agree to military exchanges, which I think are very important. And they agreed to continue the communications. I think Janet Yellen and our Secretary of Commerce, Remoto, have been trying to reach out and create bridges of conversation. That, I think, would make an enormous difference. It isn't good for China to have tariffs or to be restricted from the first largest market. It isn't good for the United States to have restrictions and can't sell into in a number of areas or invest in the world's largest or second largest population. So it would be a great thing if we could move forward. I don't think trade is going to be top of the agenda on either candidate's election criteria. I think that with President Biden, he's going to adhere to Jake Sullivan's statement of having a small yard with a high fence. And in that yard, we have the geopolitical, the high-tech issues that we are concerned about. And but if we could make progress in the garden beyond the fence, that will help. I mean, trade has always been the pillar of trust with not only China, but with all of our allies. And if you let that erode, it will not only affect the economy, it will affect our geopolitical relationships. And so I would like to see that we begin to work and continue to have meetings. I would encourage regular, high-level, small meetings on the range of issues where we won't need to have a resolution. And you'd have a different group of people that are talking about the economics of business and those who are talking about high-tech issues. So they would report, and it would be great if our presidents would meet twice a year, say, and that we would make decisions on some of these issues that have created sort of a clogging of our relationship, which is not helpful for either of us. And so I hope that we can make progress. And I think that the APEC meeting, the side meeting at APEC, was a little green shoot that is coming up, and I'd like to see it flourish.
So you think that obviously there are still going to be very difficult and sensitive areas where, I mean, Biden certainly didn't give any indication, and nobody in the administration has given indications that we'd relax things, for example, with respect to these, the most advanced semiconductors going to the Chinese market because of legitimate national security concerns. But you see still the ability to move in a lot of other areas, even of technology, as long as it's not doesn't have those security implications.
I think politically this year is going to be very tough. I don't think either one of the candidates wants to appear to be, quote, soft on China.
Yeah.
So that is a real hang up. On the other
Mhm.
hand, if we can continue to make small steps of progress with respect to the economics, and keep in mind the Trump tariffs that were imposed upon China have hurt our workers, our farmers, our small businesses. They have created no gain whatsoever. If we could gradually remove those and the retaliations that were imposed as a result of those, it would make a difference. And as again, I would say that trade is the pillar of that upholds trust, and our trust with China has been eroded. If our trade could be enhanced, and our businesses and our people could have more people-to-people exchange, if we could open the councils that were closed, why are they closed? Continue to be closed on both sides. If we could begin to take some steps to create some greater interactions, I think it would be extremely positive, and positive with respect to trade too.
So let me shift a little bit to something that obviously is related to our biggest trade relationship with China, but goes beyond that. I mean, obviously, one of the biggest indications of a paradigm shift is the move away from major FTAs, and of course, TPP was one of those. If you look at pre-2016, here we were we signed a TPP agreement, and we were quite well along in another potentially large bilateral trade and investment agreement, the TTIP, with the Europeans. So if, I'm wondering what you think. I mean, obviously, what would have been like if we had gone forward with those two deals, both in terms of our trade and economic interests and our relationship with China?
I think it was a huge mistake that when the prior administration pulled out of TPP, it was Obama's effort to try to, quote, pivot to Asia. And I think there's been a bilateral understanding that we need to up our understanding of Asia. But the Indo-Pacific economic framework doesn't have anything to do with trade in it. It's really very, very general. And the Trans-Pacific Partnership would have linked Mexico, countries in Latin America, with South Asia, and set an example. And let me just say that when you have a good trade agreement, it sets an example that is a positive one. You remember when we negotiated the NAFTA, we concluded it in 14 months. Bush Sr. signed it in December of 92, and but he had lost the election, and President Clinton came in 93 and got it through Congress, and it took effect in January of 94. Within 4 months, the Uruguay round, which had collapsed, the 123 ministers came back to the table, and they picked off of the NAFTA the opening of services, the opening of the protection of intellectual property, a whole range of issues that had not been discussed before. And it made a difference, and it went through. And time again, we can see if we set the example and it is copied, it is positive not only for us, but for the world. So I would like to see that we move forward with greater market openings, and that we should be the leader. If we are the leader, it'll be particularly important for our economy, but also for the global economy. And it'll also have geopolitical implications. You have strong economic relationships that are positive with a country. It really helps on the geopolitical issues.
Yeah, I'm interested in the comparison between what happened with NAFTA and what happened with TPP, because, of course, when Clinton came in, and as you know, I continued on and worked in the Clinton USTR. And when he came in, of course, instead of saying he was pulling out of an agreement that his predecessor had signed, he said he's not going to submit it until he works on these side agreements on labor and environment. It's interesting, those agreements are now looked back on as inadequate, but they were really groundbreaking at the time and the first effort to try to address labor and environment issues in a trade agreement.
And
but
he was brilliant to do that, because those two side agreements made the difference in the response of the labor unions.
Yeah, but you remember you were talking to a lot of the Republican members of Congress at the time who had concerns about those side agreements and were instrumental in trying to convince them that, those are sort of things that have to happen if you're going to make trade palatable to the voters. You have to address those issues.
Right.
And don't you see today, we see very much the same concerns, the same equation, I think, of how do you show that you're trying to address pressing issues like climate change and labor standards and other things in these, if we're to get back to agreements in those of that magnitude?
Well, there are actions that we can take that would set an example. And one of the first things we have to do is to create leadership that generates greater understanding of how important these issues are.
Yeah. So you think that it's still in our interest to move back to sort of classically defined FTAs? Do you see that as realistic in the post 2024 environment?
Well, I think politically it won't be easy to do, and of course it depends on which candidate wins the election. But it would be a good thing to begin to have agreements with our the Trans-Pacific Partnership would be an important one. We could rejoin the TPP, and that would be positive. We haven't signed or entered into a major trade agreement in recent years, and I think that having the rules set out so that we can say, you have to abide by these rules, and we want a mechanism of enforcement. Then we don't have to quarrel about your government. I think it's a mistake to criticize other governments that are not democratic. For example, we do good business with Vietnam. We do business with monarchs. But we shouldn't call governments that are not democratic down. We should criticize governments that do not follow rules of law and abide by the rules that they have agreed to. That is what our mission should be. We can't tell somebody else how they are to behave, how they are to dress, what they are to do. We can only say, follow the rules and that you agreed to. And if you don't want to agree to it, don't join the agreement.
Mm-hmm. Well, the one agreement that did get signed in recent years, of course, was the USMCA negotiations that, was touted by the Trump administration as replacing NAFTA. But of course, it preserved the major FTA component, that is, of a duty-free three-way trade, but added obviously some new elements. And I'm wondering now, we've had that in place for a little while now. I'm wondering what your views are as the person who negotiated the NAFTA agreement. What are your views about USMCA?
It upgraded the NAFTA. We didn't have digital trade when you and I were working together, so that the MCA has many positive features that we needed. And you don't throw out the basic agreement when it needs to be upgraded because technology has changed. And so there are some pluses. I would not have had some of the restrictions that they put in the MCA, particularly with respect to autos and the use of metals and moving them, that they have to be made in North America and actually assembled in the United States. I think that's, again, not a good example for the rest of the world. If the rest of the world were to take on that example, it would not be helpful for our growth. The whole idea of David Ricardo and all the early people who talk about opening of trade is that you want to tap into the efficiency. And some economies are great at some things and other economies are great at other things. And to the extent that we can open up our economy and have the benefits on both sides, it's a positive.
So just want to move to some issues about multilateralism and its role in any new paradigm. But first, just back on this point about these industrial policy type restrictions. I mean, in the news, credits for EVs and some of the other green tax credits and subsidies that are in the IRA and the Infrastructure Act. There are obviously what we used to call domestic content requirements. That is, prohibitions on or limitations that require you to produce either in the U.S. or in the NAFTA, in the USMCA countries in order to benefit from this. And I'm just wondering, obviously you spent many years negotiating a deal to try to limit or eliminate the use of those kinds of national treatment violations. I'm just wondering what your view is about this trend of tying tax credits for admittedly important objectives like attacking climate change, but creating a new problem in trade.
Well, as you know, I would be disappointed. I'm from open trade and not for industrial policy. But the 30% tax credit for wind or solar investments, and by the way, they do more than that, because they say not only do you have to get that tax credit, you have to meet the wage requirements. And so it's really quite definitely industrial policy. And but there are ways that you can invest in the future of your country without being discriminatory. And I would like us to follow that path rather than to try to be having an industrial policy. We have I think, a $4 billion fund to provide a tax credit for advanced energy manufacturing investment, and communities where a coal mine has closed down. That seems sensible. You put renewable energy in where they need the jobs, and it's you're investing in the future. And I would applaud that, but I think that to have these requirements that a product must be built in the United States with the United States product, and it is not setting a good example for the openness of markets that have benefited us.
But let me just play devil's advocate there for a minute, because you can see the political appeal or the political concern of people voting on these types of things and say, well, we're going to have massive tax credits, but I don't want those tax credits to go to EVs that are being assembled in China, which is the world leader in EV manufacturing. And, we're going to be basically subsidizing Chinese factories by doing this. So how do you deal with those kinds of concerns, which seem to be particularly in the development of an EV market and industry, very big concerns about whether that would deindustrialize the U.S. auto sector in China's favor.
No, we don't want to subsidize beyond our borders, and we want to be sure that we're investing in something that will have a dividend for the future. I think that, for example, the investment in where coal mines have been closed down, and investment in that area of our country is a good investment. I think that the effort to give a tax credit to you if you install and use less energy in the United States and use U.S. products, that would be something that we might want to consider. How do you get you to move from your gas heater to a solar heater, and who manufactures that? And the question is, do you want to have open trade on solar plaques? I want fair trade, and one of our problems is that where we have been restricted, and particularly with China, is that we have been limited, and so we react and adopt their restrictions rather than to get them to abide by the rules of opening the market. That to me is the real problem.
Yeah. Does raise the question of whether, from a trade policy perspective, it wouldn't be better to treat, if there's a problem with Chinese government support for those industries, to use something like the countervailing duty law to deal with imports of those products. But let's go on to, if you don't mind, talk a little bit about the WTO, the multilateral system. As you know, there have been significant and growing concerns, not just in Biden or even the Trump administration. When I had Mike Froman on, he said this went back to the Obama days and even earlier, concerns about the appellate body in the WTO. And of course, the way this was handled in the Trump administration was to block appointment of new members to the point where the appellate body could no longer function. And then, of course, the dispute settlement process was hamstrung. And for the time being, anyway, there doesn't really seem to be a resolution, although there's a lot of text discussions going on in Geneva. What's your view about not only the dispute settlement system, but what can the U.S. do in the WTO going forward? How problematic is it to be in the same kind of consensus organization with, particularly China, but also with a country like Russia? And can we make progress at the negotiating table? And can we really rely on it as an arbiter of disputes?
I think the WTO is an invaluable institution that needs to be upgraded. It reminds me a little bit of the North American Free Trade Agreement that needed to be upgraded. Neither should be thrown out. And we took the wrong tack when we started to block the, instead of trying to improve the dispute settlement or to bring in rules and adopt rules on that were not covered in the WTO. If you can't do them multilaterally, the WTO permits plurilateral agreements. We could move down that path, but we didn't. We really closed down the WTO. I think we have something like 36 appeals that have just been put in the closet. And that's not the way that organization ought to work. Yes, it needs to be upgraded. Yes, it needs some discipline. And but what have we set out as what needs to be done, and how do we proceed to do it? You had the Ottawa group that came up with ways of dealing. I think Canada gathered a group of how we could deal in the future with disputes. We didn't join, and we need to take a leadership position, and I'm sad that we have not.
Mm-hmm. And, getting to the question of sort of the difficulty of making that progress in a consensus organization with China, you see that. I mean, obviously, you've mentioned the plurilateral approach. So a little bit sort of back to the old Tokyo round idea where we couldn't get everybody on board and we did less than full membership codes in a whole number of areas that ultimately became the basis for many of the WTO agreements. But I'm just wondering that you think that is still a viable approach going forward?
I do. I think so. If you can't take giant steps, think about taking small steps toward your goal. And rather than backing up or complaining and not doing anything at all. We have really lost leadership that has come in the past from our taking a strong, setting an example in the trade arena. And it has helped us not only economically, but I think geopolitically. People think of us as a leader. If we stop doing that and just recede and complain and apply tariffs, we're going to be left behind. And so we need to pick up the flag and begin to sell our population about what is at stake. Why do you care? We've had tremendous benefits from opening the markets that have flowed from the World Trade Organization in the last 30 years. We need to continue to work on that.
And Carla, let me ask you, because, obviously you've served on boards of multinational companies. You've been head of Hills and Company, which has advised a number of these multinationals for many, many years. Do you see the kind of leadership in the business world today really as engaged or as focused on these systemic issues as they were in your day? I remember the heavy involvement of a lot of these business leaders. Sometimes people were critical that business had too much of an inside track, but certainly today, that's probably not a criticism that's being made. But my question is whether you think the business leaders are focused enough on these issues.
No, I don't. And I think back to the old days, we had, you will recall, the President's Advisory Committee on Trade. And on that committee were not only business leaders, but the head of labor unions. And we sat down and talked about the issues together. I think that made a difference with respect to the future of the NAFTA. And we ought to collaborate and sit down and talk again about how do we move forward on trade, which is a benefit. Trade creates jobs. Unions care about that. It creates revenues. We ought to be able to capture the benefits and to guard against the things that are of concern of people who are worried about the opening of markets. But definitely we need leadership.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like a lot of the tech industry sort of, the big names in the tech sector don't talk much about it, even though it's obviously incredibly important to their business models.
Right. They could do more, but all of business could do more, and could even make suggestions, recommendations, send them to Congress, have the mayors speak out about how important certain areas of trade are to their communities. That would
and governors.
Governors, start with the mayors, get to the governors.
So this paradigm shift we've been talking about, are you deeply pessimistic about the future as far as trade is concerned? Are you more of an optimist?
Worried.
I mean, there's a slippery slope, obviously, that you are concerned about. But do you think that ultimately people can be made to appreciate the concerns about that shift?
Well, let me just say that I'm very concerned about the immediate future. And I'm particularly concerned about the outcome of the next election. But if we can survive that, then I would say that I would simply send you out to sell businesses on what they must do, can do, and should do. And not only businesses, but various associations, universities, think tanks can make a difference. But we've got to, we're a democracy. Our people make decisions, but they're making decisions without all the facts. And we simply have to upgrade their factual knowledge.
Yeah, that's always been a daunting task. Even in our day back then, Carla, it was sure a daunting task. But I see Ken has jumped in, which probably means he has some questions from the audience for you to continue this discussion. So thank you. I've enjoyed this conversation immensely, and thank you very much for doing it. Ken, over to you.
Don't go anywhere, Rufus. Might call you back in.
Yeah.
But thank you so much. Real great walk through both where we are today and some of where we've been. A few different questions have come in with different angles about trade politics and about the administration's agenda. I'm just going to try to weave a few of the themes together in the questions that have come in. The key negotiations that you led, had major foreign policy implications. The NAFTA was meant in large ways to stabilize the Mexican economy and their democratic aspirations. The Uruguay round came on the heels of the demise of the Soviet Union. Obviously, today there are different geopolitical challenges facing the United States. Interestingly, President Biden, and this may not be well known by the trade community, as a senator, he voted for the NAFTA, he voted for the Uruguay round, he voted for PNPR with China, he voted against other trade agreements, but he always seemed to have foreign policy considerations front of mind. If you were speaking to him today and he asked you, how would you talk to him and suggest he use trade to help achieve some of his own foreign policy goals?
I would certainly point out the economic benefits that flow from opening trade and the costs of restricting trade. The maintenance of the tariffs that we have that go back to the last administration have a cost. You want to pay that cost, or would you like to capture that amount of money and be able to invest it in your workers' future? And I think that that argument not only is accurate, but it will have an effect. But nobody's talking about that.
So people have also asked in our Q&A here, and you discussed the WTO a bit in the last segment with Rufus. Do you think that WTO reform can happen? Can we get buy-in from both China and the U.S. on a set of reform agendas? And is the WTO capable, or does it need to be changed in a way to address some of the concerns we have about China? And is that a potential forum to address some of those non-market economy issues? Well,
China agreed to certain rules in the WTO, and there are provisions, I think, for Article 14. If a member does not abide by the rules, the membership can ask them to please leave. But that we do not want to happen. We want China to abide by the rules. But we cannot complain about China when we're becoming more Chinese than China. We have industrial policy. We have subsidies that do not comply with the WTO. We need to get our house in order, and then I think we need to upgrade the WTO. It's an invaluable organization that brings together the global economy in a way that no other can really do that. but we are letting it just disintegrate. And it's very, very sad to see that happen. Again, we need leadership to put a halt to the disintegration that is occurring and to provide the leadership to upgrade in the areas where we need upgrading. And obviously, the rules that the WTO has on tariffs, they're fine, but we need digital, we need to have dispute settlement. There are so many areas where we need to move forward, and you don't hear the United States talking about that kind of an effort. It's sad.
I thank you, and I neglected to mention that question came from John Weeks, Ambassador John Weeks, who I know you know because he was your Canadian counterpart in negotiating the NAFTA, and then was Canada's ambassador to the WTO. So I know John is listening, and I'm sure he's glad we got to that question. Love John. We have another question relates to the WTO, and it goes the other direction. And it comes from another old friend, Jean-Francois Boitin. And he asks, how concerned are you if the former President Trump, were to come back into office, that he might leave the WTO and withdraw the United States, which was threatened but didn't happen. As Bob Lighthizer, one of your successors, once noted himself, if we didn't have a WTO, we would have needed to create one. So, do you see that threat as something that we should think of as very real?
I do. I am very, very concerned about the upcoming election.
And speaking of that, do you think there are other steps that could be taken with China related to, what's happening now? What direction do you think that should go between now and the election, and what concerns might you have for after the election?
Well, I'm a strong believer in creating small working groups to deal with our economic differences. I mean, I would start with the tariffs of the last administration. If China were to remove 5 in the next week, and we were to move 5 in the next week, I don't think that you'd get a bad reaction politically. Then in 3 weeks we meet again, and China removes 5 more of its retaliatory tariffs, and we remove 5 of ours. We'll start to make progress if we can open up our councils, get the people-to-people exchanges going, the educational exchanges going. I think it would make progress. So I hope that we can move in that direction. China is an important economy. There are a number of issues that we cannot solve unless we work with China. We don't work with China, and they come up with different solutions that we think are not helpful. It's our fault if we haven't been willing to work with them in the first place. And so I want to build on the Xi Jinping, President Biden meeting that just occurred, and hopefully we can have regular, small, high-level meetings to solve the differences that have plagued our trade for so many months.
Thank you. Thanks for that. And speaking of some opportunities potentially on trade going forward, one of the things that has sort of been starting and stopping has been trade with the United Kingdom. There's been discussions of an FTA with the UK. Negotiations started in the last administration. They continued originally in the Biden administration, but then they seem to not be going anywhere at the moment. Do you see that as an opportunity to kind of get us back, low-hanging fruit, to get us back in the free trade agreement business?
I do. I'm in favor of trying to remove trade barriers wherever we can. And why not with one of our close allies? We work with the UK on everything from the horrific problems in Ukraine to the various economic issues. So let's see how we can sit down together remove the trade barriers, and harvest the growth that will come from to both of us.
Thank you. Yes, I think there's certainly a lot of interest in that across the trade community. For a final question, sort of a big picture question that's maybe not one you expected, so I hope I don't catch you too much by surprise, but we have, you may know in the last year, we've launched the WITA Academy, and we go out to university students around the United States and talk about career opportunities in international trade, trying to get young people excited about these careers, which so many of us love and have loved to be part of this community. What advice, and I mentioned earlier, we have a session coming up with the University of Nebraska at Lincoln at the WITA Institute later at the end of this month, or December 1st, I believe, for university students. And we're doing other programs with Howard University and Florida International University and other schools around the United States. Any advice for college students who might be thinking about a career in international policy or international trade that would give them some tips on how to places that they should start looking to navigate in this dynamic field?
Well, let me first of all applaud what you're doing. You're going to the Clayton Yeutter Institute.
Yes.
Clayton Yeutter was an outstanding U.S. trade representative, and then he left to go be Secretary of Agriculture. I could not have accomplished all that I did without his help, because agriculture was an extremely fractious sector in those days. And Clayton and I were like two partners. I really felt that he was just invaluable. He knew about trade, and yet he was able to talk to the agricultural people. But what you're doing is exactly what I'm advocating. I want organizations to go out and tell people what are the advantages of trade, quantify what are the growth, the GDP growth, and what are the costs of what our tariffs and our trade restrictions create. And university students, you go out and you talk to your communities, and teachers, you do that too. And try to talk to other organizations while you're in Nebraska. By the way, Nebraska happens to be one of the areas that is benefited by the opening of agriculture, and with the tariffs, they have suffered. They're one of the ones that have suffered. And to the extent that we can open that market for our friends in Nebraska, that would be a great accomplishment.
Well, thank you for that commercial for the WITA Academy and the commercial for trade. Really grateful to both of you for joining us today. Ambassador Hills, it is truly a pleasure and an honor to be hosting you again at WITA. You are an icon for all of us, and we're so grateful to you for everything that you have done over your long career in trade. And we look forward to continuing this partnership with you, and hopefully maybe even have you on at some point talking to these students. Might be kind of fun if you're willing to make the time for that.
I would certainly be willing, and let me thank you for your very generous and gracious comments. It's a great pleasure to be on a program with Rufus, and you always do a fantastic job. Keep it up. Let's try to sell the American public how important trade is to our economy and to our future.
Thank you so much. Little kudos have popped into the Q&A from Alan Wolf, our friend, and Bill Lane, who I know you also know. So shout out to both Alan and Bill, who were on there today. Thank you, Ambassador Hills. Thank you, Ambassador Yerxa. Look forward to seeing both of you again soon on the WITA platform. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Carla.
Thank you, Rufus.